Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining us for the Naval War College Foundation's 5th Annual Newport Summer Symposium, U.S. Strategic Considerations for an Effective Foreign Policy. I am George Lang, CEO of the Naval War College Foundation, and I am joined this morning by our chairman, Philip Bilden, at Spruance Auditorium at the Naval War College. We are excited and gratified to see so many members and friends of the Foundation participating today through our virtual platform. Our summer symposium has traditionally allowed 200 guests to come together here in Newport at the college to interact with faculty, staff, students, and distinguished speakers to address the many challenges in our national and international security environments. While COVID-19 has prevented us from coming together this year, it will not prevent us from engaging with leading experts to expand our understanding of security issues we face today. We are confident you will benefit from this presentation with our very distinguished guest speakers and moderator. I thank all who have given generously to support this event and prior events that advance the Foundation in its mission to support the Naval War College. Allow me to recognize the following donors for their exceptional support, philanthropy, and sponsorship. At the commanding officer level, sponsorship of $10,000 or more, Chairman and Mrs. Philip Bilden, Vice Chairman and Mrs. Dan Holland, Trustee Emeritus, the Honorable and Mrs. David Gordon, Trustee, Captain and Mrs. David Hunter, and Waring and Carmen Partridge and their foundation. At the Executive Officer sponsorship level, $5,000, Trustee Emeritus, Mr. and Mrs. William Openchain, Trustee Emeritus, Mr. and Mrs. Norman Brown, and Mr. and Mrs. Charles Mott. We remain very grateful to these exceptional individuals and to all of our corporate donors, private philanthropists, trustees, members, and patriotic supporters, and for the Robert N. Miller III Memorial and Colonel John A. and Eileen F. Carr endowment funds for making events such as this possible. For over 50 years, the Foundation has relied on the generous support of its trustees, members, and donors to enhance and enrich the academic program and educational experience at the college. Your contributions reinforce and sustain the prestige and excellence of the Naval War College and its mission to educate and develop leaders in the strategic and operational challenges that lie ahead. Your continued support of and trust in the Foundation represents investment not only in the Naval War College, but in our great nation's national security and position on the global stage. I would also like to take a moment to bring your attention to the Foundation's new logo, wordmark, and tagline, Educate Today, Secure Tomorrow. We are grateful to many of our dedicated board members, particularly Doug Newhouse, who led the effort as chairman of the Foundation's Marketing and Branding Committee, and 4 trustees who substantially underwrote the year-long research and analysis project. There is much work to do in implementing the new branding images with our broader communications platform. However, we wanted to take this opportunity today to present and share with you our new brand during this symposium. Finally, I also want to take a moment to promote the Foundation's inaugural Patriots auction that opened Wednesday, August 19th, and will remain open through Friday, August 28th. There are some wonderful Naval War College memorabilia, signed books, and opportunities for auction. So if you haven't placed a bid yet, you have until next Friday to secure one of these wonderful gifts or events or more, and good luck. Our chairman would like to extend his gratitude to you for your support and will introduce our keynote speaker, Admiral Mike Rogers. Philip?
Thank you all very much for your patience. One of the great frustrations of the COVID period is having to be adaptable and responsive as an organization, and that's one of the challenges we face. I just want to thank everyone, as our CEO, George Lang, did, for supporting us in this difficult time, both financially and operationally. And I'm glad that we've got the former head of the NSA and Cyber Command with us in case the Chinese are hacking into us as we speak. In any event, I wanted to emphasize how grateful we are to our Foundation members, our trustees and emeriti, our regional directors, and our distinguished speakers who have generously given their time and their philanthropic support to today's event. We're particularly grateful to our honorable trustee, Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who will moderate our panel discussion with diplomatic skill and finesse, following the keynote address by Admiral Mike Rogers. I also particularly want to thank an exemplary trustee who has dutifully served our foundation board for a decade and led us as vice chairman and chairman over the last 5 years, and that is none other than Chairman Emeritus Bill Obenshain. I've been honored to serve with Bill as vice chairman these past 3 years, and I'm honored to assume the chairmanship of our Naval War College Foundation to carry on his worthy legacy and hard work. Many of you will know that Bill worked tirelessly over the years to expand our national network, to engage our members, to recruit high-quality board members and staff, and materially increase our investment endowment and financial resources. But perhaps most importantly, Bill reminded us by his personal example of the importance of supporting the institution that educates our leaders today to secure tomorrow. As a testament to Bill's leadership, our foundation board instituted this inaugural summer symposium 5 years ago to convene the nation's leading experts to Newport for a privileged discussion on national security. And the summer symposium events have become important in our national dialogue on the essential role of our joint military forces and our leaders in deterring aggression, securing the peace, and partnering with allies around the globe to maintain the stability, prosperity, and democratic freedoms that we value as a nation. One of the many disruptions of this past year has been the need to convene our events virtually, such as this. But another disruption is not being able to properly honor our impactful chairman and his wife Penny for their service, generosity, and philanthropic leadership of over a decade. So we do here today and take a moment with great respect on behalf of a grateful staff, board, and foundation membership. Bill and Penny, thank you ever so much for your many contributions over the years. Before I introduce our most distinguished speaker, U.S. Naval Flag Officer and Cyber Command Commander Admiral Mike Rogers, I must recognize two other foundation leaders. First, I'm very fortunate to serve with our Vice Chairman, Dan Holland, who will be impactful in our leadership going forward as we build on a solid financial and operational foundation. Dan has offered wise counsel and kept us in a position of financial strength as our Treasurer and Finance Committee Chairman over the years. You will hear from Dan later in the program on the importance of your financial support to educate today to secure tomorrow. Thanks, Dan, for taking this on. We're also fortunate to have recruited our CEO, Captain George Lang. George took the helm of the foundation last year after 3 decades of dutiful service in uniform in the U.S. Navy, including Chief of Staff to the President of the U.S. Naval War College here in Newport before shipping off to the U.S. Naval Academy. George understands what it takes to have the foundation have a great partnership with the War College, and we're grateful for that. We're also grateful that he has built an A-team staff of professionals who are helping to modernize our foundation processes, our development and fundraising, our member engagement, and branding and communications. And I think all of you who are members would have seen evidence of this in recent months. There's more to come. So we all thank George and his team for pulling our 5th symposium together in difficult and extraordinary times. And now I'd like to say something about our distinguished speaker, Admiral Mike Rogers. Naval War College Foundation members will appreciate that preparing our leaders to defend U.S. interests in the cyber domain has been a strategic funding initiative to support our future leaders and warfighters here at the War College in recent years. In fact, the Admiral James R. Hogg Cyber and Innovation Policy Institute was funded and conceived by our Naval War College Foundation leadership and generous benefactors years before the U.S. Navy had committed the budgetary funds to the War College to incorporate cybersecurity as a major research focus. Given the importance of cyber to the Navy, to the nation, and given our foundation's leadership in this 5th domain of conflict, it is most appropriate that Admiral Mike Rogers will speak to us today. Admiral Rogers retired from the U.S. Navy in 2018 after nearly 37 years of distinguished naval service. He culminated his career as the 4-star admiral, leading as both the 2nd Commander, U.S. Cyber Command, and as the 17th Director, National Security Agency, NSA, after commanding the U.S. Navy's 10th Fleet and the Navy's U.S. Fleet Cyber Command. So for 4 years, Admiral Rogers led both the Department of Defense's leading cyber warfighting organization, as well as the U.S. government's largest intelligence organization. So to say that he is connected and knows what's going on around the world and in cyberspace would be an understatement. In his dual-hatted roles, he worked with the leadership of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, and the U.S. intelligence community, as well as their international counterparts in the conduct of cyber operations and intelligence activity across the globe. Admiral Rogers also assisted in the important work of developing national and international policy with respect to cyber, intelligence, data, privacy, and technology, issues that the War College today is working toward resolving and codifying. This included extensive work with the corporate leadership in the private sector in the finance, IT, telecoms, and technology sectors. And in fact, I recall first meeting Admiral Rogers in Silicon Valley as he was engaging with the innovators and technology companies to partner with Cyber Command and NSA to stay ahead of our adversaries through innovation. And it's somewhat amusing because I was expecting to see the four-star Admiral come in his summer whites, and in came someone who looked like Steve Jobs in a blazer. And I have to say, he was doing exactly what he needed to do to partner with the innovators who are keeping our networks and technology ahead of our adversaries. Admiral Rogers is a most distinguished graduate of the Naval War College, and he embodies the competence, the professionalism, and the impact of our military leaders who come to the Naval War College to learn how to secure tomorrow for our nation. So it is my honor to present Admiral Mike Rogers. Rogers, thank you very much for taking this on today.
Philip, thank you very, very much. And first, let's start with a thumbs up. Can you hear me and see me? All right. So, well, first and foremost, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. And I want to thank you all for your willingness to participate in this year's Strategic Symposium hosted by the Naval War College Foundation. I also want to thank the foundation for giving me the opportunity to participate and for the great work the foundation is doing to support the War College. As you've heard, I'm a War College graduate myself, but if I think of the times in my career that I was able to get education and insight as a student, but at the same time, as I became more senior as a practitioner, the times that I went back to Newport and was able to take advantage of the facilities at the Naval War College and to do, war gaming and conferences on issues of great relevance, it is a heck of a complex and an organization that really provides great value, both for the Navy and for the joint DoD team. So thanks very much, all of you, for supporting that. What we're going to do today is I want to share some thoughts with you on strategic considerations from a U.S. perspective for an effective foreign policy. And we're also going to do questions at the end. So I encourage you to use the chat function to go ahead and put in any questions that you might have or any comments that you want to make. I want to start out by first defining the topic. I already articulated it was, but remember, it talks about effective foreign policy. So effective is by definition success in producing the desired or intended result. So that doesn't mean popular. That doesn't mean necessarily beloved. That doesn't necessarily mean universally accepted, which is something you have to get used to at times. My perspective is informed, like most people, by my experiences. I have participated in the development of a couple national security strategies as a part of the DoD team that was feeding the broader effort. As well as I became more senior, as a four-star, you find yourself sitting in the Situation Room in the White House or in the Oval Office, and you're having discussions with the foreign policy team about how the U.S. is going to react to potential different scenarios. What should the U.S. position be on particular issues? And how does the U.S. actually execute an effective foreign policy? So what I wanted to do is share with you 10 insights that I have learned, so you take them from what they're worth, from my experience in U.S. foreign policy, both at the tactical edge as a practitioner when I was very junior, and then again as a four-star as I became more senior, actually at times participating in the formulation of it, as it were. The first point I would make is effective foreign policy fundamentally starts with defining the objective. If you don't know where you're trying to go, if you don't know what you're trying to achieve, then it's incredibly difficult to define what is effective. And it's also very hard to synchronize the breadth of activities, both across the government, private sector, our friends and allies around the world. You have to start by deciding what it is that you want it to achieve. What's the end state that you're looking for? And by extension, you also ask yourself, so what does success look like, or what does failure look like given this policy, given this end state? And at times you can see where, if you look at kind of the national security strategy in some ways as the formal embodiment of a foreign policy for the United States and what our broad objectives and the broad framework that we're going to use to execute that foreign policy, you've seen some that are very broad. You've seen some that are a little bit more specific, but you've got to start with an end state. The second perspective that I would share is that end state or that objective has to have some specificity to it and it has to be achievable. Without specificity, it's hard to assess progress. It's hard to assess effectiveness. It's hard to assess, are you actually achieving the goals that you have outlined? And if you make it very, very broad, if you will, then it doesn't become achievable. So for example, if you decided that your objective was a harmonious world with no disagreements, I'd say you have a low probability of success. If, for example, you define your end state as, I want a world without conflict, that's probably not likely to happen. And so I think there's value in asking yourself, not just what that end state should do or be, but how do we focus on an end state that is both achievable and has a measure of specificity to it so we can actually, if you will, assess our progress. Now, having said that, and boy, I can remember discussions on this many times, there's always this balance between, do you want to make it so specific, so concrete, or do you also want to put a bit of aspiration into it? I always thought there was value in the aspirational piece, in the pushing yourself, in the stressing yourself to achieve things that are difficult, that you may not necessarily have the highest probability that you're going to achieve perfection. But I always thought there was value in aspiration. And I also thought that aspirational piece is reflective of our society and, if you will, who we are as a nation and as a people. I would argue one of the things that marks the United States, it differentiates it in some ways from others in the world around us, is that we have always been, in our 244 or so year history, we have always broadly striven for aspirational goals. We have always tried to create a world that we knew was going to be difficult to do and was going to be difficult to achieve, but we always thought there was value in rolling up our sleeves and trying to do it. And I would argue that that still is the case. And so I always argued, let's also continue to strive for the aspirational nature of life. The third point that I would make is, even as you define an objective and you think about what the end state of your foreign policy is, there is no policy, there is no strategy that will enable you to anticipate every challenge, that will enable you to anticipate every problem. And so I always thought there was great value in spending time up front and asking yourself, so what are the foundational principles that we're going to use in executing this policy, in trying to achieve this end state, and actually implementing this strategy, if you will? Because when you have foundational principles, in the face of uncertainty and the unknown, it gives you a great initial framework to build on, because you just can't anticipate everything. I would argue some of those framing principles get into questions like, and again, I can remember discussions on this, do we want our foreign policy to be very focused on a realpolitik kind of, hey, we don't care about the nature or the characteristics of some of our friends or allies. It doesn't matter what their policies are. It doesn't matter what their beliefs are. If they're in a position to support us, if by teaming with them, we can achieve the desired end state, hey, we should do it. People are imperfect, nations are imperfect. If you're going to use perfection as the criteria in selecting your objectives, selecting your allies and your partners, I acknowledge that that can be a challenge. On the other hand, I would also argue that there is value, for example, in providing an ethical or moral framework to how we interact with the world around us. I would also argue that's another thing that tends to differentiate the United States from others. I'm not trying to argue we're perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I always thought that that was a real, if you will, core characteristic for us as a nation. But I always thought it was also a differentiator, and it was a real aid for us, I thought, at times in trying to achieve that effective foreign policy. The fourth thing I would do, we talked about defining an objective. We talked about ensuring that there's some measure of specificity or achievability, if you will. And we also talked about those foundational principles that you want to build around. I also always urged us in the process, we need to spend some time thinking about what are our strengths and what are our weaknesses, because your strengths are what you build around in executing this foreign policy, and your weaknesses are the things you try to mitigate or account for. Now, I would argue, if you look at the United States as we're trying to think about what our foreign policy should be, I always thought we had three core, if you will, strengths. The first is, excuse me, our values. There are few nations in the world where literally people are willing to die to get to. I would argue the United States is one of those things, one of those places. Literally, you do not see citizens around the world fighting to get to Russia, fighting to become a citizen in China. But on the other hand, you literally have people who are willing to cross the globe to get to America, to get to the United States, to become a part of this American dream, because they believe in our values. They believe in what we represent. They believe and value this idea of aspiration, about this idea of America's willingness to work hard to achieve a better world, and to do it in a way that's based on a set of values that recognize the individual and that try to ensure a good life for all of us. I think that is such a huge strength. And I'm the first to acknowledge, I am the grandson of an immigrant. My grandfather left the coal mines of Wales in 1925, came through Ellis Island. And I can remember asking him when I was a young boy, grandfather, what was it about America? Why did you want to come here? What did you know about us? It's 1925, so radio is in place. The First World War had concluded. He lived in a small village in Wales that was totally focused around a coal mine. He and his brothers and his father all worked in the pit in the local town, in the small village they were from, in the mountains up north of Cardiff. And he said to me, we didn't know much about America. We didn't really have any friends in America. We really didn't know anyone. But there was always this image that America offered opportunity, that America offered a chance for anyone who was willing to work hard, that America offered a great place to raise a family and to build a better life. And I think that's it's been a part of our country's core history, if you will, for all of its 244 years. And I still think that's a huge strength for us. So that first strength I said is values. The second strength I think that is really gives us an edge and is something to build foreign policy around are the alliances and the relationships that we have created over the last 70 years in the post-World War II era in particular. There is literally no other nation in the world that can match, not Russia, not China, not the North Koreans, not the Iranians. There is literally no other nation in the world that can match this structure, this set of relationships, these alliance frameworks that we have put in place that give us strategic flexibility, that give us access to a host of capabilities, locations, people. That is a huge advantage for us. And the third and final area I would argue that's always a core strength for us is our economy. People often would say to me, well, don't you think it's this big military we have? And I would always say, folks, if we didn't have this strong economy, we couldn't afford this military. It's that economy that enables us to invest in a strong defense. It's this economy that enables us to provide resources to our allies and friends around the world in attempting to achieve our foreign policy objectives. It's this economy that in part is attracting so many people who want to come to the United States. They see the lifestyle, they see the economic capability, they see the economic heft that we enjoy. And that economic advantage has enabled us to sustain a national security advantage, I would argue, for a long time. Now, on the flip side of strengths, you have to acknowledge there's also weaknesses or challenges for us. And, you know, I would argue if you look at what are our challenges or weaknesses right now, number one to me would be the fact that for the first time in a long time, you now have a lot of nations around the world, to include some of our most traditional friends and allies, who are asking themselves, so is the United States a partner I can count on? Does the United States truly value these partnerships and alliances and relationships that it's created over the course of the last 70 years or longer? For example, in our case with Great Britain, our British teammates. We have to be honest and say, you've got a lot of entities around the world looking at us saying, can I count on you? Are you going to be there? I think you also have a lot of people asking themselves at the moment, so where is that historic leadership? Where is that US commitment? Where is that US willingness to roll up its sleeves, to take on hard problems around the world, and to work with others in doing so? I think we have to be honest and acknowledge there are a lot of entities out there who are asking themselves, you know, should I bet on America? Should I count on America? It doesn't mean I think that other nations around the world who have traditionally been friends or allies want to necessarily walk away from us, but I think it does lead them to ask, so how much should I be willing to commit? How much of my own resources, how much of my own political capital, how much of my own will should I extend to the Americans and their ideas of what the world should look like and what we should be trying to create, if you will, in this global community? You know, number 6 is you also, as you're developing foreign policy, you can't forget context, whether that context is domestic or it's international. I just spoke a moment ago about how I thought internationally we have some challenges. I think you also got to acknowledge right now, domestically, we are a polarized nation that is finding it challenging to come together to address the really difficult issues. We're so frustrated with each other at the moment. In many ways, it seems our priority seems to be articulating our anger and our frustration, and not necessarily on figuring out different parties. I don't mean parties in terms of a political perspective, but different entities, individuals, groups have different perspectives. I can spend my time railing at how I think they're wrong, or I can spend my time focused on, so given that, how can we work together to achieve outcomes that benefit not just our nation, but our friends and allies, and help to create a better world, a world in which people want to continue to come to the United States, a world in which our economy remains incredibly strong and we're able to sustain a quality lifestyle and provide ourselves a whole lot of options because of that economic strength. A world where we have a national security structure and set of investments that enable us to achieve outcomes that are of benefit to our nation as well as our friends and allies. We can't take that for granted. So right now, domestically, the context is very, very challenging. And I don't think that you can pretend otherwise. The 8th one that I would highlight is, I remember I talked about early on about, hey, you want to make sure you define what is the outcome, what is the objective. I think it's also important, number 8 to me, is you've got to think through what the second and third order effects of that end state are. Let's say it's successful. Let's say we achieve it. So what is that going to mean for us, and what's going to happen as a result? And the example that I always remember is US policy with respect to Iraq, where we decided the objective or the end state was the removal of Saddam Hussein and his regime. That wasn't a bad objective, except I thought the challenge was, so if we achieve that, what happens next? Is his removal sufficient to create the world we want, to create the end state we want? Or is his removal merely a step to achieving something broader? And I thought you could tell how that kind of bit us in the butt a little bit in the aftermath of the toppling of Saddam Hussein. On the one hand, we achieved the objective. We removed Saddam Hussein and his regime from power in Iraq. On the other hand, I don't think we really anticipated what the cost was going to be in terms of second and third order effect and what the implications were going to be. I think we've said to ourselves, if we can get rid of them, that's going to be sufficient, and there will be an upswell of support for us, our policies and our viewpoints, and therefore, almost by definition, what comes next in Iraq after Saddam is going to be inherently better and much more favorably disposed to the United States. I would suggest history will show it didn't exactly work out that way. And so I always urge people when I was part of those discussions, okay, if we achieve that end state, what are the second and third order effects? What is it going to mean and what do we need to be mindful of? The last two items that I would highlight, and then I look forward to your questions, are as you're developing foreign policy, I think it's also important to be thinking about, so who are your key partners? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the groups or individuals that you're going to need to either be a part of the team, part of the effort, supportive of what you're trying to do, aligned with what you're trying to do, and in many cases, actually a part of the team and the strategy. And what are the groups that you have to account for who are potentially going to attempt to contradict or forestall your strategy, to stop you from being able to achieve an effective foreign policy? I always thought there was value in breaking that down into key partners and stakeholders, as well as potential opponents or adversaries. Who was going to oppose this? Who was going to work for it? And how did I account for them? And that's not just governments. You need to think about the private sector, industry. You need to think about key individuals. You need to think about non-governmental organizations. You need to think about, third-party actors out there who have great impact, have a ability to reach audiences, for example, that is a government entity. We're just not, particularly a US government entity, we're just perhaps not going to be as effective. Those are all, possibilities that can really help you as you're trying to achieve that end state, as you're trying to make sure you actually are creating an effective foreign policy. Again, if we define effective as actually achieving the desired or intended result. And then the final one that I would highlight, it's not enough just to have a plan. You have to communicate that plan. You have to assess that plan's effectiveness. And quite frankly, you have to spend a lot of time thinking about how can I create advocates to help me execute that plan. It's great to have a great plan. It's great to have developed a set of policies designed to achieve a better foreign policy end state. But if you can't tie them together in a coherent whole, if you can't explain them in a logical and rational way, if you can't articulate what you're trying to achieve in a way that people who aren't involved in foreign policy, who weren't a part of the process that you use to develop it, you've got to be able to communicate in an effective way with a whole host of people, many of whom have little knowledge, little interest in the plan itself or what went into its development. You've got to be able to speak to those citizens in the heartland of our country, to speak to our key allies, to speak to those individuals around the world that we're trying to reach out to, that we're trying to impact. You have to be able to speak in a way that they can understand and relate to. Doesn't mean that everybody's going to agree. Again, as I started out by saying, I don't think that's the measure of effectiveness here, that, hey, if everyone agrees and everybody loves it, it by definition is effective. That isn't my experience. Others may have a different experience, but it's not really my experience. And so as I, said to myself, so Mike, what is it that helps you develop an effective foreign policy? I was just struck by those 10 things. Start out by defining an objective or end state. Number 2, ensuring that that objective or end state has at least some measure of specificity or is achievable. That you needed, number 3, you needed to spend some time thinking about what are the foundational principles that you want to build this policy around, because you're never going to be able to anticipate everything. How are you going to actually achieve the end state or the objective? You really have to develop a plan or a strategy. It isn't enough to say, hey, I just want a better world. Thanks. That concludes my input. That's not going to get us where we need to be. You really have to spend some time, and that gets you into ways and means. That gets you into how you evaluate effectiveness over time. You have to continually reassess what you're trying to do in foreign policy. Is it being effective? Number 5, you need to spend some time thinking about strengths and weaknesses up front, because you both want to play to your strengths. And also, quite frankly, you want to try to mitigate your weaknesses so they don't work against you to a significant effect. You always want to remember, number 6, you always want to remember context. Number 7, be leery about defining your foreign policy objectives too narrowly. Like I said, one of the values, and I apologize, I think I failed to say this. One of the values is, I thought at times we tend to define national security very narrowly. And one of the things I think you're finding in the 21st century is that national security has a whole lot of broad implications, from the very traditional foreign policy kind of things to economic policy, trade policy, how to, again, because I think the economy is such a core component to our foreign policy and to our ability to create a better world around us. I think you have to acknowledge that. It's interesting, for example, if you look at differences between the current national security strategy was written in 2017. The previous strategy, I think, was like 2015. One of the differences between the two is, for example, in 2017, the administration made the decision to remove any references to climate change as a national security issue, whereas in the 2015, the Obama team felt climate change was a significant aspect of national security and needed to be addressed as an element of our foreign policy, as an element of our national security strategy. I always thought you do need to think about more broadly. I always felt that there were strong national security, strong foreign policy implications on the topic of climate change, for example. Number 8, as I said, you want to think through the second and third order effects if you achieve the outcome. So you're not just thinking, okay, I've got success, everything's finished. Number 9, make sure you're identifying key partners and stakeholders. And number 10, and finally, let me conclude my remarks with, look, it's not enough just to have a great plan or a great set of policies. You have to be able to articulate what the rationale is, what you're trying to achieve, why you think they're going to be effective, why people should support it, why our citizens should be willing to expend very scarce resources, why they should feel comfortable. You have to create advocates in the end. And with that, Philip and George, thank you very much for the opportunity. We got about 10 minutes or so before we go to break, but I welcome the opportunity for questions.
Admiral, thank you very much for your thoughtful and engaging remarks. You're correct. We have about 10 minutes for questions. I appreciate you getting us back on track. And I'm happy to relay them to you from our audience. Of course, it looks like the first 2 questions that come in leverage your expertise in cyber. So the first question is from Tom, and he says, can our systems deter China's threat to our cybersecurity? And have we implemented such determinants?
So first, I always thought, and again, I used to make this argument with the nation's leadership, there is a low probability that we're going to be able to guarantee that no system can be accessed, either in the DoD, in the government, or in the private sector. So our strategy for cybersecurity, therefore, must be built around more than one component. I thought one component was this idea of let's make it harder, let's make it more difficult, let's make the probability of success lower for potential adversaries, whether they be nation states, groups, or individuals, who would attempt to penetrate our systems, whether they wanted to manipulate it, extract data, extortion, whatever the objective was. I thought there was value in doing that. But at the same time, I always said that's not going to be enough. The other component we've got to add is, in addition to making it more difficult, we've got to also ask ourselves, what are the actions that we can take that will change the risk calculus of some of these actors, that will lead them to believe, hey, even if they were to be successful, even if they could penetrate our systems and do what they want, we needed to convince them it's not in your best interest. Even if you could be successful, the broader price you're going to pay is way too high. You don't want to go down this road with us. And I always thought that was the hardest part. And there's no single component to that. It wasn't just, well, let's go back at the adversary in cyber if they come at us in cyber. My attitude always was cyber is one component. It's one arrow in our quiver in terms of what are the capabilities we can bring to bear, either in response or as part of a coherent strategy designed to convince adversaries they don't want to go down this road. You can argue if it clearly hasn't been totally effective because activity continues. But on the other hand, I will say, I think the developments in the last few years in cyber broadly have been very positive, even as the terrain and the activity itself continues to be of great concern.
Very good, thank you. Another related question, likely from John, and it says, how have we resolved thus far one state or non-state actors' cyber activity against another state under the law of armed conflict? That is, have we resolved cyber activity that interferes with or damages a state's critical infrastructure in times of peace as a hostile act, and if so, to what degree?
So if we say, have we resolved, I would have to say broadly, the answer is no. There is still no single agreed to international definition, legal or policy. There is still no domestic US government agreed to definition of what is an act of war or what is an offensive act within a cyber context. That discussion continues. You have many positions out there on that. For example, if you look at NATO and what they have done in the form of the Tallinn Manual, which is the NATO Cyber Center in Tallinn, Estonia, has put together, they're up to version 2.0 right now, if you will, a series of strategic thoughts on what might be the characteristics of an act of war from a cyber perspective. It hasn't been fully agreed to globally. And we in the US had a few areas where we didn't agree totally with it. Bottom line, within a US perspective, the position has been and continues to this day, we will make that decision on a case-by-case basis based on the actual activity of a specific event in a specific place and time. That can be frustrating. I'm the first to admit, go back to 2014 when the North Koreans launched 2 Viper malwares designed to slick the BIOS or basic operating system, if you will, on Sony's computer systems, as well as the theft of their intellectual property in the form of movies, as well as stealing their emails and corporate data and then making that publicly available. I thought that might be a trigger that would lead us to define a cyber event for the first time as an act of war. In fact, I remember saying, could we step back? Because if this same destruction had occurred because of a cruise missile or a bomb, we'd be having a very different discussion. But because it was caused by 2 software programs, we seem to be willing to just take that whole idea of, is this an offensive or an act of war, off the table. And so for Sony, for example, we chose, US government position at the time was, we defined it as a criminal act, the destruction of private property, in this case, Sony's computer system. We defined it as a criminal act. You've had several events since then, NotPetya, and some other things. They still haven't, NotPetya, probably the biggest global event we've had in cyber. June of 2017, the Russians launch a malware through a Ukrainian tax service that people in the Ukraine who use this tax service would go to the tax service's website and download what they thought was this tax software. And instead, what they downloaded was a software that was designed to go after your computer's operating system and to lock it down so you couldn't, in fact, use it. And it quickly proliferated, not just within the Ukraine, but in many areas of the world, particularly Asia and Eastern Europe. Not as much, thankfully, in the United States as we saw in other areas. That didn't trigger it. So the thing I always wondered is, and then I'll shut up because there's more value and more questions. What's the criterion we're going to use? Is it the physical act? Hey, someone, even attempted to do it, and that's enough? Is it some threshold of damage? If you cause damage 100 million, 200 million, 10 million, 5 billion, 100 billion, is there some monetary threshold? Is the threshold loss of life or injury? Is the threshold values? I can remember in Sony, we were discussing what the nation's leadership is an attack against freedom of speech, the ability, in this case, of a movie company to develop a movie that parodied, if you will, the leader of North Korea, a core value, if you will, for the US, reflected in the very First Amendment of our Constitution, the freedom of speech. Is an attack against values sufficient? I don't know. The reality is we just haven't come to a conclusion yet. And I often wonder, how bad does it have to get before we do come to a conclusion, and what will shape that conclusion?
Certainly a lot to think about. The third question from John, a little bit more broad. What actions will the next U.S. government need to take to shore up American alliances?
So I think, number one, a clear articulation that we value alliances, that we believe alliances generate value both for us as well as others. I think there's a fundamental question out there right now from some nations wondering, well, do the Americans really value these relationships? Do they really want to build around them? By participating in these relationships, am I, as another nation, am I going to get value, or are the Americans merely going to disregard whatever it is that particular alliance or framework wants to do? Will the Americans publicly chastise me and my nation? So number one, I would start with a very public declaration that we value alliances and relationships, and that we view alliances and relationships as a core component of our strategy and policies in dealing with the challenges in the broader world around us. And it's not just, from a military perspective. I would argue, you look at the global response to COVID right now, it is embarrassing to me. I'm not talking about the United States, I'm talking about the global response. The greatest health situation probably is a world we have faced in a century, and yet there is no well-synchronized, well-focused, agreed-to framework for how this party of nations around the world are going to partner together to attempt to deal with this issue that is literally affecting every nation on the planet. And yet we seemingly cannot come together. I just think that is a searing indictment of where we find ourselves right now.
I agree. Thank you. And then along that, it's great front man. I guess the next question we have from Eric, and likely our last question, is how do you think the United States should prioritize or perhaps reprioritize threats in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic?
So it's interesting. If you look at the national security strategy, for example, go back to 2015, it largely tended to focus around the non-state actor, really counterterrorism, terrorism, if you will. In 2017, you saw a new administration and their national security strategy, and I was part of that. Their national security talked about that the greatest challenge was revisionist nation states, was the phrase that was used. Really think about authoritarian states like China and Russia that wanted to overturn in many ways the mechanisms and the structures and the practices that had been put in place in the broader global community to address issues of global security since the Second World War. And many of them, quite frankly, if we're honest, the US created it. The US, it was our idea. The US actually provided the majority of the funding to support it. But what you saw was a shift in the focus to these nation states. Now we find ourselves, it's 3 years later, and we're dealing with this global health issue, which reminds us that as important as the nation state is in this broader global environment that we are a part of, not all issues are defined solely through the prism of a nation state. And you see issues, I would argue, like health, COVID-19, climate change, technology and its implications. You see a host of issues that are really not defined by a nation state. On the other hand, does the focus on nation states give us a starting point, at least, in which to deal with these issues. I always thought the challenge, even boy, in the middle of terrorism, when that was at its height, Al Qaeda, ISIS, I can remember thinking, we cannot define the world through the prism of a single issue. It is just way too complicated. There's too many other things going on. And if we're not careful, if we define the world through a single issue, whether it be terrorism, whether it be revisionist powers, nation states, if we define the world through a single issue, we're going to miss a lot of things, and we're going to wind up not anticipating but reacting. And COVID is a good example to me of, we didn't really anticipate well here, and now we are totally reacting. And again, because we can't come together either domestically or globally, you're watching this disease and you're thinking to yourself, again, I only speak for myself, this is the best this world, this nation can do. Come on, we're better than this. We can do more here. We can create a set of policies and practices, both for us as a nation and with a broader set of partners out there that can help combat, if you will, this global pandemic. But, you know, I remain an optimist. Don't get me wrong.
Well, thank you, sir. I appreciate that. But thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedule to spend it with us this morning. You are a true friend of the foundation. We are grateful for your continued leadership and expertise and support in so many areas, and many of which you addressed this morning.